You're on.
Welcome to the Psychotherapy Summit. You guys aren't doing me. Hi, I'm Diane Pohl-Heller, and welcoming you again to our summit. This is our fourth evening, and I'm really glad to have you back. And if you're just joining us, if you want more information on how to catch up, you just hit your upgrade button and you'll get a lot of information of what we've already done. And we're diving ahead in our Psychotherapy 2.0 Summit, again, exploring the leading edge discoveries and teachings with experts on neuroscience, trauma, mindfulness, relationships, and attachment theory. And there's about 20 hours in the course, and you can, if you want, sign up for 21 CE credits. Today we have Stephen Porges with us. I'm really excited about this experience with him today. He's going to be discussing the clinical application of the polyvagal theory. We're going to find out a lot about that today. You're there, Steve, right? Hi, Steve.
I'm still here. Hi, Diane.
Hi. Great. And what we just had on our first night, we had Rick Hansen on positive neuroplasticity. Then we had the pleasure to talk with Ellen Bader on lying and how to confront our clients in couples therapy. Last night we had Sue Johnson with emotional focused therapy and all of the wisdoms therein. And if you want to catch up again, you can also look at psychotherapysummit.com. So you'll see there's some button you can hit for some handouts, and if you want to do the upgrade, you can download things and have your own personal library. You can find out information on your page as you're watching this this program. So Steve has really, I feel, created a whole body of work and really beautiful research in so many disciplines, across so many disciplines, that it really supports all of our efforts with the somatic strategies on how to work with trauma and how to understand how we cue for risk and cue for safety. And it's a huge understanding of how our physiology really works. I'd call it a great owner's manual developed by Steve. And has a huge bio, a list of accomplishments, and he's the distinguished scientist in Indiana University. He's a director of the laboratory at the Kinsey Institute, which is really going into the exact biobehavioral effects of trauma. I'm really excited to learn more about this. And he's a professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina, as well as professor emeritus at University of Illinois and Maryland. And he's written and published 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers. So we're really going to dive deep tonight. So thank you for joining us and sharing your first day of the week as we dive in. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve, and I'd love to hear a little bit about the background of how you moved in the direction of the polyvagal theory and the relevance of the social engagement system.
Okay, so good evening and good to see you. I can't see you, Diane, but at least talk to you. The polyvagal theory was almost, let me use this, I'll give you a little history here. It was almost like a fortuitous accident. In my own academic career, I felt I was doing fine. I was looking at parameters of heart rate patterns. I was creating new metrics that would measure vagal regulation of the heart, and I was linking it to all different types of medical disorders and psychological problems, and even processing of information. Then I published an article in Pediatrics, so this is a long time ago, it's 1992, and I was trying to describe in this article the beneficial and positive protective effects of vagal regulation of the heart on babies, and trying to show that preterm babies came into the world without much vagal regulation of the heart. And I got a letter, and the letter was from a neonatologist who said, "I read your paper, I found your paper very interesting. However, when I was in medical school, I learned that the vagus could kill you. Perhaps too much of a good thing is bad." When I got that letter, I said something is amiss. And first of all, I started to think about his perspective. And so we always have to, in a sense, shift perspectives to get information from other people and other people's disciplines. This neonatologist was talking about bradycardias and apneas. That's when heart rates get precariously slow and the baby stops breathing. And those were actually vagal responses as well, but so were the protective rhythms that you could see in heart rate that were due to also vagal activity. And I noticed in my own work that as long as they had the rhythmic respiratory input into their heart rate patterns, the babies were doing very well. So I was now stuck with what I call the vagal paradox. How can you deconstruct something that is two systems that apparently are being regulated by the same cranial nerve, but one is protecting you and one is potentially killing you? And that led to all the work on the polyvagal theory, which was trying to discover how these pathways work. And the answer to this paradox was that there were two different vagal pathways, and they developed sequentially, and they developed phylogenetically, so meaning that our very old ancestors had, vertebrate ancestors actually had this older vagal circuit, and that function was to reduce metabolic resources. Now, this has become, I'm going to go through this a little bit to make it a little easier to understand. But once I started to explain the two different vagal circuits, I really started to identify a second defense system. Now, everyone who has gone through some form of psychology, some course somewhere along the line, and even in the public press, we talk about fight-flight behaviors as if they were our only defense mechanisms. What polyvagal theory reintroduced, so I won't say it discovered, I'm saying it reintroduced and articulated the neural mechanism, was a shutting down response as defense. And those of you who are clinicians, and especially those of you who work with trauma, realize that that is one of the features that many people who have trauma histories or abuse histories have experienced. And that is behavioral and physiologically shutting down. And of course, what comes along with that is often states of dissociation. So what the polyvagal theory did was basically identify a neurophysiology of the actual symptoms that trauma victims and trauma people that experienced trauma were really describing. And in a way, it provided a witness. It validated what they were saying. And before that point, people were saying, oh, you're stressed out. It must be high cortisol, high this or high that. And people would say, no, I just passed out. I shut down. They said, well, I don't quite understand why that happened. Maybe it's because these systems aren't working right. So what the theory did was provide an explanation. And I will use the term to my surprise, the first major clinical group that really found true value in the polyvagal theory weren't the neonatologists or the obstetricians, which was the group I was really, initially working with, but it was the trauma therapists. And what I want to do now is I like to show the first slide. Are we up with the first slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll need feedback because I can't see the first slide.
I was waiting for it.
Okay. The first slide is basically a picture that you have seen in virtually all your textbooks at some point in time. And it's the presentation of a cranial nerve coming down from the brain, and you'll see an arrow and it says vagus. That's a nerve that comes from the brain, and it goes down and goes to lots and lots of organs. And it's your major parasympathetic input. And on the other side, on the left-hand side of the picture, is a picture of the sympathetic nervous system, which literally is exiting off your spinal cord and creating a ganglion chain along your spine going to basically the same organs, or in general the same organs. And because the two systems go to the same organs, we have been taught that there's a apparent antagonism between the two, that they're kind of like in a mortal battle. If the sympathetics work, you're stressed. If the parasympathetics are more dominant, you're in a state of relaxation. Well, that part of the story is only marginally true. And the part that's marginally true is that, yes, both systems often go to the same organ, and yes, often both systems are continuously innervating those organs. But our autonomic nervous system literally functions in a hierarchical way, and that makes things very predictable. And if we go to the next slide, and if you give me feedback when that comes up.
It's coming. It's not. There we go.
Okay. Now, what you're seeing is that vagus, and you see all those organs, but you also will see a dotted line. And the dotted line is your diaphragm. And what it's really saying, and you can see the line of the vagus, one vagus is going to organs below the diaphragm, and one pathway from the vagus is going to organs above the diaphragm. The organs, the vagal innervation of organs above the diaphragm come from something that's very uniquely mammalian. It's part of being a mammal. It's a very myelinated circuit. It means that it's insulated, can respond rapidly. But in the brainstem, that nerve is interacting with the area of the brainstem controlling all the muscles of your face and head. So, and including your voice, which is controlled by a vagal nerve as well. So people literally are carrying the state of their heart in their face and in their voice. And when people have, it's good positive affect, especially in the upper part of the face, and when their voices have prosodic features, intonation, that is in a sense cueing you that their bodily state is comfortable and safe. And if we really want to think about the history of vocalizations occurred in evolutionary history long before language. So it was the sounds of vocalizations that were important and not the words. And our body still has those receptors for those sounds and not for the words. So if voices have prosody, intonation, and melodic features, they cue others that the body of the other is safe. And that's how animals who didn't have language, and that means most of the mammals, that's how they cued each other. And that was uniquely mammalian. Mammals could cue each other by voice, and the voice was linked to their heart and their lungs. Okay. However, the vagal pathway that goes down below the gut is part of a very ancient vagal circuit that was around with very primitive vertebrates. And it was actually, when it gets recruited as defense, it means that people will defecate. It will even impact on the heart because there are some fibers still going to the heart, and people will pass out. Now, when people can't mobilize to defend, then this very ancient circuit becomes a defense circuit, and then people will pass out and have all kinds of gut problems. Now, what I want to signal at this moment, I want to cue you onto, is the organs below the diaphragm. When the vagal system is used as defense, it means that those organs are now going to have various forms of pathology or atypical function. And I want you to think about your patients, your clients, and whether they suffer from subdiaphragmatic disorders, gut problems, irritable bowel, those types of issues. And also, I want you to think about whether they have fibromyalgia. And that's because the sensory part of that vagus influences our pain network. It affects, so the sensory pathways on the vagus are affecting things. So what I really want to emphasize now is that we have two different vagal pathways, an ancient one, which we still retain. It helps support our underlying homeostasis. It's all fine, except when it gets recruited for defense. So what I'd like to do for a moment is really switch to slide 3 for a moment.
Waiting for it. Take just a second.
Okay.
Here we go. Quest for safety.
Okay, so now what we're really going to introduce to you is that the autonomic nervous system has functionally 3 components. It has this neuromyelinated vagal circuit, it has the sympathetic circuits, and it has this unmyelinated vagal circuit, but it's hierarchically organized. And what that means is that the newer circuits, when they are running the show, meaning our social engagement, our new myelinated vagus, then the other parts of the autonomic nervous system support our body's needs. So it supports homeostasis. What happens in terms of trauma and other types of disruptions is that the new myelinated vagus gets turned off for defense, and then it basically allows or permits the sympathetic to be defensive. And if the sympathetic nervous system doesn't get us to safety, then the old unmyelinated vagus takes over and shuts us down. So we can kind of think that our whole agenda in terms of our evolutionary heritage is to be safe. That's what it's all about. We're all about negotiating safety. And mammals negotiated originally using expressivity that was conveying physiological state, and we still do that. So again, when you talk to your clients, a lot of them will go into various bad states and start to even dissociate if they hear a low frequency monotonic male voice, or if someone will yell at them, because those features are so wired into our DNA that they are features of predator. low-frequency monotonic sounds trigger predator. And so when that occurs, the system that is used for defense now becomes liberated. And the first system is to mobilize. But what happens to children and smaller people, or if they're in places where they cannot flee or fight? They can basically will shut down if they're fortunate. So in shutting down, they'll dissociate and they won't feel the pain. So what you start seeing is this hierarchy. But I've already given you another cue that if you wanted to stay out of shutting down behaviors, you run and move around. And as long as you actively move, your body can't go into a shutdown, because to actively move, you recruit the sympathetic nervous system. Now, reflecting on clinical cases, you find out that people with trauma histories of immobilization and shutting down often gravitate to high-risk behaviors and highly mobilized behaviors, because as long as they're moving, they can't shut down. But let's look at this slide for a moment. And what we really are saying is that our nervous system is evaluating the sensory world, the world outside of us, and it's making interpretations of that sensory world. And I basically generated a new word. I called it neuroception. And I called it neuroception because the nervous system was doing an evaluation of risk in the environment without awareness. It was just doing it. It was reading the features like prosody, gesture, the intonation of voice, the intentionality of movement. Perhaps the best example is that people have dogs. If you have a dog and a stranger comes into the house and wants to meet your dog, and the stranger places his hand and goes behind the head, the dog's nervous system sees the movement of the hand beyond his view of sight as a threat behavior. So there's an interpretation of intentionality. And of course, people with dogs understand the power of vocalizations, because if they reprimand their dog by talking in a low voice, monotone, the dog will basically hunker down. So we understand more about neuroception from our pets than we often do from our spouses, our mates, our friends, and our children, because we expect humans not to interpret the intonation, but to listen to the words. And we basically cut short or minimize the power of the human experience, which is to take these sounds and to change our physiological state. So the green box that you're seeing on the left really means, what are the cues of safety? What are the cues that enable the myelinate vagus to work? Well, those cues are intonation of voice, facial expressivity, especially the upper part of the face, and gesture. Now, if someone engages you and you engage someone and they turn away, the actual physiological response is often to get mobilized, either feel bad about yourself or be angry at them, because they have violated your neural expectancy of an interaction. So that actually triggered a sympathetic mobilization response. But if the cues are so profound, like a low yelling voice, and you can't mobilize your body to get away, your body may actually start to shut down. And this, with people with trauma histories, is very, very real to them and often described. And one of the problems with the history of trauma, or actually trauma research and trauma practice, is that the trauma victim was actually re-victimized by therapies and by people not understanding that they went into a state that they didn't really have control over. They lost their control of voluntary behavior. And so they became senses of shame and guilt for not navigating out of those situations. So if we go to the next slide, and I have 2 more slides to finish up this, or 3 slides to finish up. Okay. So the next slide's up?
Yes.
Okay. It's basically saying that there are 3 phylogenetic steps that our autonomic nervous system went through. And phylogeny is a word that really means our evolutionary history. So what was our evolutionary past? What were the mammals that were, or I should say, what preceded mammals? And what preceded mammals were a type of, basically a primitive reptile. And primitive reptiles, what were their defense systems? Their primary defense system, or one of the defense systems, was to immobilize, to become inanimate. to disappear. And that we inherited, and that's an unmyelinated subdiaphragmatic vagus. We still have that. So the oldest circuit that we have is this unmyelinated vagus, and for us, it's the primary regulator of subdiaphragmatic organs. It still has a few pathways going to the heart, and it can create the bradycardias and the apneas that neonatologist talked about. And if you're a preterm baby, you come into the world without that mammalian vagus. You come in with a reptilian vagus because the myelinization process occurs or starts to occur after 30 weeks gestational age. So with a real preterm baby, they're at risk for bradycardias and apneas, just as if they were a reptile. It would be their defense response. The second stage of defense system is actually this mobilization. And of course, those systems are important to our physiology. They're not just there for defense. So subdiaphragmatic organs are involved in digestion, and they're also involved in reproduction. So they're involved in a lot of very positive things in our lives. But when they're recruited in defense, then the system starts changing its features. Likewise, the sympathetic nervous system is a wonderful system. It enables us to mobilize, and we love it because it gives us energy, and we use it when we play. But when we use it for defense, it starts turning off things. So since the autonomic nervous system is hierarchical, if we recruit the sympathetic nervous system for defense, we turn off our digestion. We turn off that whole vagus. And then, since it's hierarchical, we then recruit the newest circuit, and this is that social engagement system with the myelinated vagus. Then those other parts of our autonomic nervous system can do their homeostatic job. And I have just the next slide is to kind of give you a sense of phylogeny. Okay, and basically what you can see, and I have to put my glasses on to see, you can see that the old unmyelinated vagus came in about 500 million years ago. The sympathetic nervous system came in about 400 million years ago, but the myelinated vagus is more like 300 million years ago. You start seeing these circuits starting to come in at different places, and they represent the adaptation of these vertebrates to new niches. And mammals, by nature being a mammal, require social interaction and require being able to cue another of safety. And also mammals require nurturance. They just come into the world, they can't take care of themselves. So think of the metaphor where a turtle will lay their eggs. The eggs will hatch, and the turtle by themselves will run into the water. Humans can't survive without being taken care of. And our nervous system literally craves co-regulation, regulating with another or connectedness with another human being using that social engagement system. And then finally, the last slide is just a set of metaphors you think about. When we are challenged, first we use our head, and we use this new ventral vagus or myelinated vagus, and we talk to people, we smile, we engage. If that doesn't work to put us in a state of safety, then we will use our body, our limbs. And once we start using our limbs, we've turned off our social engagement system, and we now have stimulated our sympathetic system to support movement. But if that doesn't get us into safety, then we often just immobilize, shut down. And so you can basically see the sequence of the hierarchy of the autonomic nervous system as it supports both social and defensive behaviors. And our job as human beings is really to enable our autonomic nervous system not to be recruited in defense. Okay? So now it's back to you, Diane.
Well, you said so many valuable things here, but one of the things that I think the therapists might really find valuable is how do we reverse this process? Because so many times our trauma clients come in and they're already in the immobilization, they're already having the depression or the oxygen conservation or the digestive issues or organ issues that you're talking about. And I just wondered if there was something you'd like to speak to clinically, like how we bring people from immobilization to sympathetic mobilization, and then eventually as we complete that sequence, it opens up the social engagement.
Right. So I have actually spent a lot of time thinking about this because I have the good fortune to be invited to a lot of conferences on trauma, and I get opportunities to listen to a lot of my insightful colleagues who are clinicians. And so I decided that I would try to deconstruct what they were doing to see if there was a common theme in trauma therapies. And I came up with basically one basic feature. And the feature is, first, you respect the implicit feelings of the body. So a lot of it has to do with an awareness of bodily feeling. But the awareness of bodily feeling often is so overwhelming that when people are in that state, they're not present anymore. So therapies are literally always moving between the recognition and the acknowledgement and the validation and the witnessing of implicit feelings, and then shifting over to explicit movements, either voluntary motor movements or words, or in a sense, even with a lot of somatic therapies, actually moving the body. So what you're really doing is going back and forth to literally diffuse the power of those implicit bodily memories, which are feelings, they're physiological. And you're not allowing them to drive the personal narrative. So and again, part of polyvagal theory is that the underlying physiological state functionally drives the personal narrative. It creates the neural platform upon which higher brain structures are then recruited. And when you're in certain states of defense, certain portals just are not available, because the portals are going to be those of defense and self-protection and not of engagement and socialization. So what we're doing, or what many of the therapies are doing, is that they enable the individual to move, to gain control, and that movement and gaining control is moving the implicit to the explicit and then going back and forth until there's kind of a generalization of this capacity, or this capacity to regulate or to be resilient, so that the internal visceral feelings are no longer that overwhelming and frightening. And that's what I think is going on. So I think as part of it is a understanding of the bodily response. And this goes to another concept that I've talked about, which was this concept of neuroception. And actually, can we flash up the next slide, because I think that would be helpful. It's the personal TSA agent. Okay, so in a sense, neuroception is our body's own evaluation of risk. And if we didn't want a terrorist on an airplane, if we didn't want any terrorists ever to get on the airplane, we would basically not allow anyone to get on the airplane. And in a sense, people who have trauma histories, their neuroception has been reset. Their physiology reads cues that are neutral and sometimes positive, reads them as being negative, because that's the physiological state they're in. And what I wanted to really emphasize is that we tend not to be aware of the cues that set our physiology off, but we are aware of our physiological response. So the features that tend to set us off have a lot to do with whether or not there's violation of social engagement, or whether, so if you want to calm a person down, the intonation of voice is powerful, facial expression. If a person has a trauma history, then face-to-face may not be useful. However, prosodic voice may be very powerful. And then empowering the client might be very important. But what happens is that as we start giving the cues of us to the social engagement system, the defenses start to downregulate. And what happens really is that we feel our physiology shifting. And when that physiology shifts, then certain spontaneous behaviors occur. And everyone has experienced a feeling of something in the pit of their stomach, or a sense of anxiety in their body. And often what the natural thing that people do is really to create a personal narrative that supports that. So I didn't like the event, I didn't like that person. Okay?
So it seems to require that therapists get a little bit more accustomed to tracking physiology and understanding that perhaps slowing down and really making a space for what people are feeling in a sensate way. I think therapy has been so dominated for so long with cognitive and emotional focus, which is important too, but to really understand these physiological shifts gives us a map in a way of how to really help somebody move through and out of a trauma response.
Yeah, I think it's the issue of manualization of therapy versus being a master clinician. So if there are master clinicians, people who are just wonderful, they have good results, independent of their treatment model, and this has been known for, I think, decades. And the features of the master therapist has always been people use terms like empathic connectedness or presence. And what it's really about is that the therapist is giving cues to the neuroception of the client that it's a safe environment. And when that occurs, all kinds of wonderful things start to occur. So the system, I'll give you a metaphor. And, it's not a metaphor, but it's a useful analogy. I travel a lot, and when I'm in the airport, I often see toddlers with their parents. And you always will see a toddler screaming when it's with the father. But if the father brings the screaming toddler to the mother, and the mother just looks towards the child, extends a hand, doesn't even touch the child, but talks in a prosodic maternal voice, crying always stops. What happens is there's literally a cognitive intention which the father had, but the biological intention of the prosodic features of the voice and gesture is what the mother has, and the infant picks that up, and the infant regulates. So we go through life kind of looking for mates or people that will help us co-regulate. Often we find them, and often we have limitations. And I often say that some relationships are built on mammalian reptilian principles, meaning that the mate, one of the mates is a mammal, one's a reptile, and then the closing statement I make is, but at least the reptile is there, so there's continuities, there's predictability. And I have I was talking this summer at a group, and there was a clinician, actually two clinicians were sitting in the front row, and they were both married to engineers. And their comment was, changing the world one engineer at a time. And the idea, of course, was that in certain disciplines, people are less emotionally in touch, and they're more object-oriented. And
do you believe also that when you have a mammalian, if you're going to call that partner, or a partner that maybe we could also say is a little bit more comfortable in secure attachment, that just by the person that isn't, maybe has more insecure attachment or a little bit more reptilian, that by the person that's reflecting more social engagement kinds of responses, that eventually that would sort of pull the other person perhaps a little bit more into connection, or do you think?
I would say that's the optimistic story. And
okay, well, I'm optimistic.
But one would hope, yeah. And
the idea always work that way.
Well, because you're really, it's a degree of patience to make another person feel safe without getting into the cognitive issues of how much time am I putting into this, what am I getting back? And all relationships have some of those balances to it. And so the answer is, you're absolutely right. If we were all that, in a sense, it's not even the word compassion, it's not the word I want, benevolent. If we were all that benevolent, you would be absolutely right. That knowing the features, having the commitment, we could, in a sense, change that person. But I will actually say something else, and this is kind of like, and that is, why would we be attracted to someone who was not, in a sense, having some reciprocity with us? So, in a sense, part of the attractiveness that people have when they find partners is usually some reciprocity, some co-regulation, some give and take back and forth, because that's what our bodies are looking for. That's what we looked for when we were born. That's what some of us got with mothers. Some of us didn't get that with mothers, and some of us got it with spouses, and others didn't. But that's what we're looking for. We're looking for, actually, I'm going to put it in very simple terms. We're looking to be able to be safe in the arms of another. We're looking to give up all forms of vigilance and defensiveness and just be, so that we can immobilize without fear. So I think the whole goal of being a mammal is this ability to literally fall asleep in the arms of another.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful summary of that. I really love that. I was reading some of the the articles that you sent me, and I always love reading your work. And you made this point about play in a way that play, we start maybe from a calm place, and then play happens and activates because it's movement, and maybe even some like play fight, like how dogs and cats do it, and also how humans do it. And so we activate a little sympathetic, and then we build a little bit of resilience around it, and then maybe somebody comes in and calms it back down again. So there's sort of this interesting role that play has. And I loved your comment, and I really agree with this, that schools and education is kind of going the direction like play is almost a waste of time, or it's taking away from the serious learning that could be happening, and it's not a skill, and that we're really missing our opportunities for connection and working out that kind of co-regulation in the way the nervous system moves, and sort of a range of resiliency, I would say.
Absolutely. If we thought of play as neural exercise of the features of the social engagement system, and remember the social engagement system has the capacity to trigger and signal safety so that our rest of our autonomic nervous system doesn't get recruited for defense. And if we play, and so I'm going to really move us back to what we learned about play. And we learned when we looked at kittens or dogs that they were literally practicing their hunting skills. But if you look carefully at kittens fighting or playing, their claws are retracted, and they don't break skin, and they have role reversal. All these wonderful features of play, which one is role reversal, awareness of other, presence. And what we start realizing is that animals that played were actually going through neural exercises that enabled them to have better control of their behavioral state. And it's really quite remarkable that we are literally so uninformed that we remove all these opportunities of neural exercise to regulate physiological state from the developmental schools, from the sequences that we put our children. We forget that regulating state provides the opportunity for the cortex to be developed. So it enables us not to react to as defense, but for us to be calmer for longer periods of time. And yes, the schools have really blown it because they've gotten rid of music, they've gotten rid of theater, they get rid of recess because they put more time doing cognitive tasks. And they're losing more and more children with diagnosis of various behavioral disorders, meaning that the child can't regulate their state within the classroom.
Well, and they're also, thinking of advancement, right? We're also moving towards more computer, so even less face-to-face with the teacher. And you made the point in your article too that even with doctors now, they're on their computers with your history. They're taking everything you say, and they're looking at their iPad, and they're not looking at you. So we keep moving away in all different ways, right? Whether we're visiting the doctor or we're in school, away from this absolutely necessary facial expression and ways to really support social engagement, which really supports our sense of safety.
Absolutely. And like with medicine and education, we can just kind of focus on those two. And it's really clear that the power of medicine historically was not in the drugs, it was in the interaction with the physician who provided a sense of safety and prediction and comfort. And what have we done to that? We've reduced the medical periods of time down to 10, 12 minutes. I was in Canada last week, and apparently they have a sign at the, they have a universal health coverage, but their general practitioners have a sign that if you, in a sense, have more than 2 symptoms, schedule another appointment. And which is just totally outrageous, because if people have more than 2 symptoms, it will give you much more information about the system in their body that's not working. So we think of medicine as organ specific, not as neurally regulated. And we forget that treatment of people is not medicine oriented or surgically oriented, it's people to people. So people have to feel safe and comfortable with each other. I actually show a slide in my talks of children in classrooms with iPads. And it's really interesting to watch them. They're attending to these iPads, and what are the teachers doing? Well, they're talking to each other. So the teachers know better. They know that linking to an object doesn't have the same relaxation or engagement function. The other part is that we basically co-opted two terms. One, play, and we talk about play in terms of computer games, which are not truly face-to-face interactive. And then we also talk about social networking, which is asynchronous usually, using the internet. And so people miss all the features that we have required through evolution to make us feel safe and comfortable with another. And it's just very important to have that contact.
I think it'd be great for us to highlight kind of the extreme of this, because when somebody's had trauma, you can't be in a defense state and in a social engagement state at the same time. Right. So they lose the cranial nerves that actually activate the face. So their face tends to get almost sometimes a death mask, or it could even just be part of the face. Or their inner ear loses its ability to really hear and listen and hear tones accurately. And they're scanning for threat. They're stuck in a physiological state that sees danger and then has all the behaviors that go with it. And I think it's really helpful for you to say a little bit more about that, because it's such a, I think, not fully understood situation. And I think even therapists are reacting to the lack of responsiveness and, all of that's going on in the office. And I just think what you're explaining, I just want to highlight that. So I'd love you to say more about trauma work.
So we were basically criticizing for a moment the medical profession, where they turn away from people and do medical records and don't really have the person talk about how they feel. And we also were talking about being in the classroom. Okay. Now let's kind of rotate about 180 degrees and ask the problem, or describe the problem that many parents have if their child was preterm or diagnosed as autistic or extremely hyperactive, or even a trauma case. And that is, HIV is another one, is where the face isn't working in a way of providing the caregiver, or the parent in this case, positive features. So parents of hyperactive kids, or basically autism is frequent, because I've heard this in my own lab, is that parents will say, I love my child, but my child doesn't love me. And what they're really saying is the child's not giving them the facial cues, the intonation of voice that reassures them that their engagements are being reciprocated. And what you're saying is, when we deal with people with trauma, they are, in a sense, being victimized in the social world that they're put in, because their face is not giving the cues to others. And so it becomes very difficult to others, including therapists, to be empathic and to be engaging. And that's when we start understanding the power of vocalizations and prosodic features. And I have done work with autistic children, and I now have a clinical trial going on with children with abuse histories, where we're using a listening therapy which takes vocalizations, actually female vocal music, and computer alters it to literally amplify prosody, to see if we can trigger that portal of social engagement. And we did very well with autistic kids. We actually reduce auditory hypersensitivities and improve social engagement, and also raise the vagal regulation of the heart. But I don't know how successful we'll be with people with trauma histories. But the theory is, giving them the cues at such a amplified level, the body can't refuse them. That was the whole theory, that you give them the prosodic sounds of vocal songs, and where prosody, the features of the frequency modulation that makes things sound melodic, are exaggerated. And I'll give you kind of another metaphor. Bill Clinton has a very prosodic voice. And the story used to be that the Republicans would come over to the White House to talk about things. They would leave feeling just wonderful, but not knowing what they agreed to. And this is the notion of prosodic voices making people feel safe, that they kind of lose some of their hypervigilance and defensiveness. And in a way, therapy has to understand that neurophysiological structure that we have, and has to leverage it to change the physiological states. There are other mechanisms that can be used, including breathing. So if you watch, a lot of people are literally are very, very anxious. And if you watch their breathing, they're taking very short gasping breaths, and the duration of their phrases, the number of words they say without taking a breath, is very, very few. And one way you can actually get them to extend the duration of exhalation is having them add words to their phrases to speak longer durations. The reason exhalation is important is that it's during the state of exhalation that myelinated vagus is doing its work, meaning it's downregulating the sympathetics. So that's why breathing therapies work, that's why singing works, that's why playing wind instruments work, because you're doing exhalation. Exhalation is really an exercise of allowing the myelinated vagus to go on board to calm us down.
And probably if you think about movement, why yoga works, and
Yeah.
why in China, if someone gets depressed, I heard they have them work in the rice fields. I mean, just something
Yeah.
to get action. I know I've taught somatic experiencing for 25 years, and now I'm also expanding to really take a deep focus on attachment. But I notice what's so beautiful when you're working with this kind of dorsal vagal response, or this sort of shutdown conservation of energy space, when you've called it death preparation, because usually we default to that reptilian defense when we've either perceived accurately or otherwise that it could be it, right? And it takes us there.
Let's drop the word perceived, because all these responses are not voluntary.
Right.
Our body is interpreting something that we are unaware that it's interpreting, but we're very aware of that physiological state we're going into. So it's like if someone says something, and you start feeling something in your gut or in your legs, the blood is rushing out, you're getting dizzy. It's not the words. You don't know what happened, but you know the body happened. And then you're trying to figure out what went on. But often if it creates a mobilization and we start physiologically changing state, we don't know what cued it, and we may start having attributions to people around us that they don't really deserve. So yeah, the issue is that once we understand what our body responds to, then we can start changing those physiological states through very simple interventions, which have to do with movement or breathing. So your point about the Chinese with depression and rice is that it's incompatible to be, in a sense, in a state of immobilization depression if your body is moving. So the act of moving keeps you from shutting down.
What I find so interesting clinically, because I live in this territory, I mean, this is what I do, in terms of my clients, but is that when I sort of can help their neuroception shift. I mean, they start to either orient, and they start to register a little bit more safety, or my presence or my voice or my facial whatever is helping with that, hopefully. And then also sometimes just like having a fantasy or their own movie of like moving a threat farther away, or a disturbing sound farther away. They start to actually move into sort of an intrinsic movement. Their body just starts to do it on its own. And I love that, because I find it so empowering. They feel their body has this wisdom, because they're really just following your sequence, right? We're just trying to create a scenario in the session where we can kind of prime, if possible, right, towards mobilization. And then, of course, as that completes, the defensive part of that might release, and then we can move right into social engagement. But your map, it's made this, it's made the different shifts so somewhat, you don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but you know why it's happening, so you know how to phrase your clinical interventions to support the next physiological shift. And I find that I really feel it reduces the experience of the trauma survivor in terms of the pain and suffering so hugely that I just feel like I'd like this information to be, I don't know, thrown out of the end of airplanes, just so that everybody understands how they work personally, but also how we can work more efficiently as clinicians to reduce suffering. And I really feel this is a huge understanding in that direction.
Well, thank you. Now, there's part of what we evolved to, the words I use is eloquently and efficiently move from mobilization into social engagement, or back and forth. That's what we're good at. But moving out of immobilization with fear into social engagement or even mobilization is not that easy. Our body the pathways weren't there. The reason mobilization to social engagement were so efficient is that we had to shop. We had to find out if someone was safe to be around. And so the initial mammals were very small, and they had to find this out, and they basically were testing it with vocalizations. Are you safe? They weren't saying that, but they were using intonation of voice, and if they got the wrong frequencies back, they got out of there. So we, as mammals, had to reproduce, had to find mates, had to identify safety, at least for short periods of time. So we're good at that. And the issue is when people shut down, can you get them moving, but not moving in defense? Can you get them moving where they have some containment of the movement, where there's more explicit or more regulation of it? So in a sense, acting out something and then moving, and in a sense, controlling or putting a different label onto the visceral feelings, as opposed to allowing those implicit bodily feelings to drive them. The other part of what I wanted to really say is that so often we allow our bodily feelings to be our motivators. In a sense, it motivates us. I feel bad, therefore I don't like that person, or I have to get out of here. Because we start taking the feeling and then we structure a personal narrative that makes some sense. And part of the value of polyvagal theory is that the polyvagal theory gave people who had severe trauma experiences, it gave them a personal narrative that didn't victimize them. So if they had shut down and hadn't fought or run away, they understood what their body was doing for them in a very positive way, as opposed to being blamed for not being aggressive.
And that all these reactions are intended for protection and survival.
Right. And I mean, I've gotten several emails from people who had really severe trauma experiences in their youth and were unable to get any validation or traction when they try to explain their feelings. Because everyone would say, well, why didn't you fight? Why didn't you get out of there? Why didn't you do this? And they finally felt that they were validated when there was an understanding that their body was doing a very adaptive thing, was helping them, was protecting them. And so I think one of the major problems, or let's say the crisis within the trauma world is, in a sense, the validation and witnessing of what happens to people without telling them what they should have done. And I think understanding that there's a biological response, that it's not a good behavior, it's not a bad behavior, it's our body's attempt to deal with features of danger. This is neuroception and the features of life threat, and this is what our body is doing. It's not that we want to be there or we want to be part of this uncomfortable situation. This is what our implicit act of our body's doing for us, and in many cases, our body has done us great favors.
Yes. That we befriend the body again. We feel the positive intention. It's very empowering. I have to say, when I first studied trauma work and also the neurophysiology of it, and I was able to explain to clients when they came into my office, I have to say, probably 9 out of 10 of them always say, oh my gosh, it's the first time anybody's understood. And I think that's got to be true for SE therapists out there, and Pat Ogden's therapists out there, and anybody that's really integrated your work. I know it's integrated in many, many disciplines now. Just the fact that somebody gets it and it validates it, and you can feel the truth in your own physiology.
Yeah. Well, to me, I mean, there's certain things that are realities that are so easily understood once you, what I call, use the lens of the polyvagal theory. I tend to be still shocked that a certain understanding of this isn't in a sense incorporated into let's say, even the treatment of HIV patients, because part of the virus is neurotoxic on cranial nerves. There's neuropathy of the cranial nerves. So there's what's looking like both a wasting, but the upper part of the face is blank. And I'm giving a talk on Monday on HIV and the social engagement system. And part of the issue is the caregivers of people with HIV basically go ballistic because they feel they're being exploited because they're not getting what they think is the love back because the upper part of the face isn't working.
in a way, as caregivers or therapists or in any of these fields,
Yeah.
we have to understand this so we're not personalizing. Of course, we're going to personalize it anyway because we're reacting on an unconscious level. But the more we understand it, then we can maybe,
it's powerful.
Give people a break, understand it, not take it quite so personally. I gave a keynote a couple years ago to a sexual abuse conference, and I really focused on the physiology because I felt like so many of us don't know it yet.
Yeah.
And so I gave a lot of examples. I showed videos. I showed people going through these sequences. And because I love this work so much, I'm sort of an ambassador for it, I guess. But I use it all the time. And the feedback I got from one of the organizers was, well, I wish you would have talked about something we understood better. And I thought, but the whole point of me being here, really, it's because I think is a challenge in our field, because I didn't get any kind of training like this in graduate school, of course. I mean, they didn't even talk about trauma in my graduate school program. Yeah. It was a wonderful program. I had great professors and all of that, but I learned all this stuff sort of during and after, and I'm so happy that I just feel really lucky in a way that my training went this direction, because I really feel that it minimizes or reduces, it mitigates suffering. It doesn't take it away. I mean, there's a lot we have to, it's not a magic wand or by any means, but even just helping people really be validated and understood, I think it's huge. And then you can actually help them go through the sequences once you have that kind of training.
Yeah, well, it gives you a map of where you want to bring them, but everything is predicated on whether their body can functionally negotiate a state of safety.
Right.
And that's where vocalizations become a very important portal, because it's the one sensory channel that can't be blocked. So people can turn away, but the voice is still going to get there.
So therapists need to maybe really pay attention to how their voice is and how they're using it, and if it can move a little bit more melodically, right?
Right. And we all know what an anxious voice sounds like. We know what a predator or low booming voice is. But what we forget is that we have to be, in a sense, more present, more aware, more mindful, whatever word we want to use, that our voice conveys a tremendous amount to anyone that we're talking to, whether it's a client or another person in our environment. And I still think when I'm saying this, in the back of my mind, I'm seeing myself as a parent, and I have two great sons. However, I will tell you that my voice as a father is not when they were growing up, is not the voice you're hearing tonight. Because we were, even in my world, I was so focused on what we say as being important, not how we say it. And in doing that, I was not sensitive enough to my children and what they really needed. And they needed the sense of safety, and everyone needs a sense of safety.
You mentioned something that I thought was really significant. I would like the audience to hear too, in one of your articles, about how even with touch, it's important that sound precedes it, a good prosody, and also hopefully some warm facial expression prior to touching, because without that, sometimes then it can be, even though it was intended as affection, it can actually be felt as aggression. So I thought that was really important for people to know.
Exactly. Again, I'm going to just switch it to my two little dogs. When they play, they chase each other, and one tries to catch the other and basically takes a bite into the rear leg, not hard. And what does the one who's bit? The one that's bit turns around, looks face to face at the one doing the biting to see if there's an intention to do harm, or are they playing? So touch is ambiguous. We're not exactly sure. So how does the dog signal that it's just play? Well, they roll reverse, and the dog who did the biting now runs away, and the other dog chases. So they're giving the cues of role playing and reciprocity. Now, with many children who have various forms of diagnoses like autism or spectrum disorders or hyperactivity, often children don't want to play with them. And part of it is they're not giving the reciprocity, so that children get hurt while playing with them. So even though the child has the intention to be part of the group and play, the child's awareness of other isn't so good and isn't picking up the cues.